to the Thar Foundation Pavilion, and welcome to the launch of Farooq Bajwa's From Kutch to Tashkent, the Indo-Pakistan War of 1965. I'd like to introduce your moderator, Mr. Omayr Syed, who is a political analyst as well as a prominent businessman.
Are they on?
Munni is here somewhere.
I think they're on.
Hello. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, my guests. We are here to discuss and launch the book by Mr. Farooq Bajwa. It's called From Kutch to Tashkent, the Indo-Pakistan War of 1965. So before we move on to the discussion, just a brief introduction. We have with us Mr. Javed Hussain, who has retired as a brigadier from the Pakistan Army. And he was also involved in he's been in the Pakistan Army Special Service Group for many years. And other than that, he was in the Armored Corps. Farooq Bajwa is a prominent lawyer based in London. He has authored many other books, and this is the most recent book that I have come across, and I look forward to discussing this with you, Farooq. Also with us is Mr. Nauman Naqvi, who is a political analyst, and hopefully he will be probing Farooq more deeply on this book.
Actually, I'm a professor, not a,
Yes. Okay.
I the director of the Comparative Liberal Studies program at Habib University.
Thank you for the additions. So before we go into the general discussion, Farooq, would you like a brief overview of the book? What was the objectives of the book and what did you conclude?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's always important to remember why a war started and how a war started. So when we look back at the context, Pakistan obviously came into being in 1947. And this 1965 war is only 18 years after the creation of Pakistan. So in other words, in historic terms, it's actually quite soon. The state of Pakistan had barely got on its feet. It had been just 18 years, and an all-out war pretty much with India breaks out. So why did it break out? How did it break out? These are the sort of questions I try to answer in the book. It's a military and diplomatic history. I'm not a military expert. We have a brigadier here, I'm sure, has more military knowledge than I have. But I was able to use the diplomatic archives that were available in the US and the UK. I managed to get some memoirs that were written by Indian generals, Pakistani generals, who managed to write quite honest accounts of what went wrong or what went right during the war. And so eventually a pattern began to emerge and a clearer picture began to emerge of what happened. So in essence, very quickly, in 1965, a decision was made by the Pakistan government that it would try to solve the Kashmir dispute by force. Pakistan had received a large amount of US military and economic aid during the 1950s. And so come the 1960s, Pakistan was feeling much more confident. It had some good American weaponry in terms of artillery, air force. It was economically prospering at that time. So it felt pretty good about itself. India in 1965, by contrast, actually wasn't feeling so good about itself. Nehru had died, who had been India's prime minister for many years. A relatively untried prime minister, Lal Bahadur Shastri, had taken over. India had been beaten badly in the 1962 war with China, and its military limitations had been shown up. So Pakistan felt that this was quite a safe bet, that if it was to attack in Kashmir, first through the use of guerrilla force, and then if need be through use of the regular army, the Indians probably wouldn't fight long. They would probably sue for peace, and the war would be all over quite soon. And it's quite an old adage in warfare that no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. So almost everything that could go wrong, I'm afraid, with Pakistan's plans did go wrong. The guerrilla force that was sent during the summer of 1965 didn't receive any help from the people of Kashmir as expected. The military campaign that was following up from that didn't go expected to plan, and in fact, as it was close to achieving some of its military objectives, the general was removed mid-battle, a new general was appointed, and then most fatally, India attacked Lahore on the 6th of September 1965. against all the military and political predictions of the Pakistan government at the time. They had thought that the war would be confined to Kashmir. They wouldn't have to fight a regular battle in Lahore. And so, rather incredibly, at the beginning of the war, there was hardly any defenses in Lahore. And when India attacked on the morning of 6th September about 4 a.m., troops were actually woken up by Indian artillery and tanks and bullets going overhead. So the long and short of it was that it was a hard-fought war for about 3 weeks. But America knew that this war wouldn't last more than 21 days. The weapons that Pakistan had been given during the 1950s were literally meant to hold an enemy. In that case, the Soviet Union, not India, was imagined as the enemy. But it was never designed as an offensive force. And so sure enough, within 21 days, Pakistan was running very low in ammunition, spare parts, people. There wasn't any military breakthrough. And so eventually Pakistan accepted a UN-sponsored ceasefire on the 21st of September 1965. And then, as the book implies, it was at Tashkent where the Soviet Union, as it was then, sponsored a peace treaty between India and Pakistan, which effectively meant that the border went back to exactly as it was before the war. In other words, Pakistan gained nothing. Not 1 inch of India territory was conceded. India refused even to discuss the Kashmir issue at Tashkent. And so I'm sorry to say that it was quite an unfortunate episode in Pakistan history. Those of you who were here a couple of days ago probably heard Naseem Zehra talk from Kargil to Coup. And I'm afraid it was a bit of a sense of deja vu reading her book, because many of the same assumptions or predictions that the Pakistan army had made in 1965, it repeated again in Kargil. And so it seems that we somehow seem to be on this fatal loop of repeating these same mistakes time and again. So this is, as I said, a book which I hope readers will find interesting or enlightening. I've tried to be as neutral as possible, because in a war, ultimately, there was no winners in this war. Neither India won nor Pakistan won. So people died. There's nothing really to celebrate as far as I'm concerned in it. I don't want to sound derogatory to the soldiers who fought. Many of them fought very bravely and very well. But as far as the objectives of the war were concerned from the Pakistan side, I'm afraid none of them were realized. And with hindsight, I don't think any of them were probably realizable. That's, I'm afraid, the rather long and short of it.
It's a rather sobering assessment, but yeah, that's something that we need to discuss more, but it tends to get drowned down by patriotic and nationalistic jingoism. So I'm glad we have a chance to discuss history rather bluntly. Brigadier Javed, would you like to add something to Mr. Bajwa's rather sobering assessment of the war? Do you disagree?
Actually, this was a lesson in how not to fight a war. The 1965 war, both sides committed blunders, blunder after blunder after blunder. And Field Marshal Ayub Khan, who was the president as well as supreme commander of the Pakistan Armed Forces, he was given to understand by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who was the foreign minister at that time. Ayub was given to understand that if Pakistan army provokes the Indian army, the war, if it starts, will be restricted to Kashmir. Restricted to Kashmir only. And even after you cross the international border, which the army did, the Indians will not start a general war. So right from the start, Ayub Khan had indicated that he is scared of starting a general war or fighting a general war with the Indian army. So everything that he did, that is Ayub Khan, was half-hearted. You don't fight half-hearted wars. The result was that opportunities that came our way, Pakistan Army's way, they were wasted. Because take a Kannur, Operation Grand Slam, which was launched after the Gibraltar force infiltration into occupied Kashmir. Grand Slam was about to capture Akhnur Bridge, which would have cut off Indian line of communication to the valley. Akhnur is close to Jammu. Now, a few words about these operations.
Please.
He had been encouraged, Ayub Khan was encouraged by the victory in the run of Kutch in April 1965, where the Indians were thrashed and the areas which they had occupied, which Pakistan claimed was theirs, they were liberated. So encouraged by this victory, easy victory, Ayub Khan was told by his advisors, his confidants, that now is the time to wrest Kashmir from India. And the way to go about this is we send thousands of, 5,000 to be precise, infiltrators into Azad Kashmir and hope that the Muslim population of Indian occupied Kashmir would rise in revolt, in rebellion. Now when the special service group, my old unit, the special service group, SSG, when they were taken into confidence, they said that Gibraltar operation as planned will fail for a number of reasons. One, the Muslims living in occupied Kashmir, when they were contacted by the SSG was a frequent visitor, cross-border visits. And they said that they will support the infiltrators only if the infiltrators defend us from the inevitable Indian retaliation, retribution. If that is the case, then 5,000 is a very small number for the large territory that occupied Kashmir was and is. In order to be able to defend the Muslim villages, we will need a force of 150,000 infiltrators. And this was also suggested by China. Nothing less than 150,000. The objective would be to throw the Indian army in the defensive. And the people will rise in rebellion. But this analysis was rejected by the planners of Operation Gibraltar. So when the SSG was given to understand that the operation will go as planned, 5,000, they made it very clear. They sent it in writing, in fact, to Army headquarters in Rawalpindi, that the operation as planned will turn out to be Pakistan's Bay of Pigs. This was that CIA-inspired invasion of Cuba. And the invaders, they were all disposed of. So on the night of 5 and 6 August 1965, 5,000 infiltrators crossed the ceasefire line and went across on a broad front. In the beginning, these infiltrators, they carried out spectacular operations, raiding Indian Army headquarters, ambushing Indian Army columns. But after that, the people refused to, the Muslims refused to cooperate with the infiltrators because the infiltration force was too small to protect them. And that is precisely what happened. They were unable to protect them, and a village called, I think it's mentioned in the book also, Batamulu, was burned down, killing hundreds of Muslims.
So one of the first assumptions was already proved wrong before the war even began, that the Kashmiris are going to support Pakistan.
They presumed, the planners presumed that they will support the infiltrators. But when the people were contacted, the Muslims were contacted, they attached this condition that yes, we will support you wholeheartedly if you protect us from the inevitable Indian Army's retribution.
So Grand Slam was supposed to be like a second phase of the plan, first to launch the irregulars in the form of Operation Gibraltar, and then the second punch would be Operation Grand Slam, which
I'm
would...
coming to that.
Ji.
I'm coming to that.
So was there any rethinking done at the planning level?
No.
Omayr, I think Nauman Sahib wants
Ji.
to say something on this.
So
I think Nauman Sahib wants to say something on this.
Mr. Nauman, I was going to come to you, but you would like to add something?
No, obviously I'm the odd man out here since I'm neither a military historian nor a Fauji or a retired Fauji myself. So I'm going to come at this from a very different angle. I found your book very interesting, and of course it's greatly needed, given the fact that we actually celebrate the 6th of September, which makes absolutely no sense given what actually transpired. And such false nationalism is extraordinarily damaging to the public mind. Yeah? And in fact, one of the reasons why, as you were saying, we keep repeating such misadventures, as in the case of Musharraf, who continues to say that he's proud of Kargil. Yeah? As if there's anything to be proud of, just as there is nothing to be proud of in the 1965 war. There was absolutely nothing. It was a foolish misadventure which came to its logical conclusion. Now, what I'm interested in, apart from the account, as somebody whose PhD is in anthropology and who teaches history and literature, is the mentality behind the larger mentality that governs such delusional practice. Yeah, because the remarkable insouciance with which the entire war was undertaken is what deserves analysis. Yeah, कि ये किस तरीके से ये सोचा, how was it possible to think, yeah, that with such little and incompetent preparation, yeah, and with completely bizarre objectives and assumptions, yeah, such a war was launched. And the 65 war was actually totally definitive in terms of the development of both Indian and Pakistani nationalism with respect to each other. Because nationalism also has a trajectory. So, Wazira Zamindar, for instance, in her book, The Long Partition, which is a very, very interesting book, it's about how, in fact, our national identities are created after partition, and the narrative stops at 65 because whatever options remained were shot off after that war.
After 65.
It was quite definitive, 1965, in terms of the consequences that it had both in India and in Pakistan. Now, about that mentality, what I'd like to say is, yeah, that there is a racial component, yeah. There is a racial component to our thinking, yeah. For instance, many people continue to think, yeah, in Pakistan, despite the fact that we've lost a number of wars now, that no Hindu army can defeat a Muslim army. Yeah? These are assumptions that continue to abound. Yes. Now, these assumptions, and in the case of Pakistan, these assumptions are particularly relevant because we also inherited from the British the martial race doctrine, yeah, which actually continues to greatly influence both the Pakistan army as well as the way we think about our culture, about the various ethnicities in the territories of Pakistan. Now, from Farooq Bajwa's Sahib's book, I'd just like to read, since we are here to launch this book, I'd like to read a brief passage. This is from the final chapter, Reflections on the War. And here he's talking about the American position reviewed. So he says, one of the best examples of this, what he said earlier, which gives us an indication of the mood within the White House, was the account of Robert Comer, who was the national security advisor to Johnson, who was, of course, Kennedy's vice president, and someone very much in the center of the diplomatic action. In a detailed interview years later, Comer explained that while Johnson was still vice president to Kennedy, he had been summoned by Johnson while on Air Force One to explain Kennedy's pro-India stance to him. Johnson had asked Comer, I like Ayub. Ayub is a very good guy, and those Indians are the worst people to deal with I've ever seen in my life. Why is Kennedy switching around to a more pro-Indian and less pro-Pakistani? Comer had replied, and this is a long quote from Comer, which is very interesting. Listen to the language. It's the language that I'm particularly interested in and what it implies about the way they think. I like Ayub too, and I think that any American who has ever had much to do with the Indians and the Pakistani ends up liking the Pakistani a hell of a lot more than the Indians. Now, here are the reasons why. This is very interesting. In the first place, the Pakistani their forebears were the Aryan invaders of India. So they're more Western, like us. This is 1965, yes? 1965 में वो अमेरिकन कह रहा है कि पाकिस्तानी जो हैं are more like us Goras because they are the inheritors of the Aryan invaders of India. सोचें, I think people don't have any idea, really don't have a full sense of the extent to which Gora thinking is racial, how they think about things racially, yeah, which we've inherited, yeah. And in the second place, the Indian Hindu philosophy is quite antithetical to our way of thinking, whereas Mohammedanism, any Muslim call it their religion Mohammedanism, or Mohammedanism. Mohammedanism is much closer. You don't make foreign policy on the basis of who you like and who you don't, etc. And then he also says, Comer said that the fact was that Pakistanis were much more presentable and that they talked much more our lingo, the American lingo. The Pathans and Punjabis are tall, upstanding guys. See, totally martial race theory idea. Now, the other aspect of this, of course, is that this racial thinking is also imperial thinking. Yeah? Kyunke unko, what's the foundation of this racial doctrine as it emerged in the 19th century is that there is a global war of races, a global survival of the fittest, competition of all the races of the world against each other. This is a 19th century idea, which of course continues to persist. Yeah? Now, in our case also, the results of this racial thinking, thinking about Hindus as a race, thinking about Muslims as a race, and thinking about the relations between them as an imperial competition, which Muslims in particular are destined to win. Yeah? And thus you hear all this stuff about the Ghazwa-e-Hind and whatnot. Yeah? Kamal hai कि मैंने किताब खरीदी ना just as a sample. Yeah? There's a 2,000-page book, this massive tome, yeah, from one of the book fairs. उसका नाम क्या था? निज़ाम-ए-कायनात, निज़ाम-ए-कायनात, ग़ज़वा-ए-हिंद और वजूद-ए-पाकिस्तान. यानी कि ग़ालिबन खुदावंद ताला ने कायनात को इसलिए वजूद में लाए कि ग़ज़वा हिंद होगी और इसीलिए पाकिस्तान भी वजूद में आया. अच्छा, इसी तरीके से आप देखेंगे तो I was teaching a class in American nationalism, about American nationalism. क्योंकि originally तो ये imperial racial imagination गोरों का है ना, right? So वो उनकी ideology का हिस्सा है manifest destiny. Americans have this sense, yeah, that their nation has a manifest destiny in terms of ruling the world, really, yeah. So I was looking up manifest destiny on the internet, and guess what? One of the first things that showed up was Pakistan manifest destiny. Pakistanis also, and of course this kind of ideology is particularly concentrated in the military. Yeah, Pakistanis also believe that, and you know, all kinds of mixtures of religion in this, they have some kind of imperial destiny. Yeah, and which is totally delusional, of course, and results in these kinds of misadventures.
And it's also a part of our history in the sense that before the British, there was this perception that we were the ruling class, so we have a right to...
No. That's a very, very important difference. So this is an exercise that I carry out with my students all the time. If you think about the empires of the past, say in our region, to begin with, what is the immediate predecessor to the British state, to the British Empire? Well, we call it Mughal, although that's not what they call themselves. They call themselves Sultanate-e-Taimuriya, the Taimurid Empire. Yeah, Taimur is, of course, the name of Taimur Lang, and Taimuriya are basically his descendants. It's a dynasty. It's a dynastic empire. The empires of the past were dynastic empires. The modern European colonial empires were national empires. British Empire, French Empire, Spanish Empire, these are national empires. There was no such thing as a Muslim empire. Ever heard of an empire by the name of the Muslim Empire? Sultanate-e-Islamiyya? या सल्तनत मुसलमानिया सुना है किसी ने? So it is very important, you know, if we are to understand things in their proper historical perspective, to not confuse these very different historical phenomena. So the national racial complex, yeah, which is also imperial, that's modern.
It is. Thank you for your comments. Yes, one of the themes of the 65 war, as we were discussing, has been that it was considered, it was a national project, people were confident, people were very jingoistic about it. And people say that 1965 war was kind of like a second partition, in the sense that before that, the kind of trade and the people-to-people interaction that was happening, the media was very much, a binational.
Indian films were still shown. Indian films were banned after
shown
the 65
After
war.
65. So that created the second partition, which created a lot of the roots of the polarization that we see today. But, Farooq,
I think two things which are not often realized with
before we
hindsight.
go back to the nitty-gritty of the war itself, we just wanted to discuss a little bit of the background.
Exactly.
And then,
There are 2 points that often are not realized about the 65 war. One is how much armor Pakistan lost in the 65 war. We lost so many tanks that the Indian army actually almost formed a pattern tank regiment from captured Pakistani tanks. And it was only under American pressure that they stopped. That directly, in my view, I may be wrong, led to the 71 war. Because India now in 1971 was not afraid of any retaliation from Punjab side. It knew that if its army entered Bengal, Bangladesh, they could do so with impunity. So the 65 war directly, 6 years later, it's not a coincidence that 6 years after 65 you have the 71 war, because now there's no fear on the western border anymore. Up till that time, Pakistani armor always had a slight threat factor inside the Indian military psyche, which was now gone. The second thing, which I think people don't realize, is that after 65, just as we had our martyrs and our soldiers, India had its. It now made a diplomatic concession from an Indian prime minister almost impossible on Kashmir. Even if India had wanted to do it in the 1950s, in the 1960s, up till 65, there was a possibility. Nehru had talked in 1963, 64. He had sent Sheikh Abdullah to Pakistan that let's try to resolve the Kashmir issue. After 65, the Indians said, whatever happens, we cannot now make political concessions because you guys have killed our soldiers, you've invaded our territory, you've tried to grab this by force. So until even a couple of years ago, getting the Indians to even mention this K word, for them it's almost an allergic reaction because just as we lost soldiers, they lost soldiers. Then they don't want to talk about it. And it's made peace, frankly, very difficult ever since.
And in the 50s, if anything, we were at a stage in which Indian state was still reaching out to the Kashmiris, working on ways to incorporate Kashmir into the state. And that whole process, Article 370 and its later iterations. So that was a different phase. In the 50s, they were actually trying to, incorporation wasn't a foregone conclusion. And I think after the India-China war was probably the last time that under US pressure, serious, to whatever extent, talks were held between India and Pakistan.
Well, as I said, it needed more than a generation to pass. It wasn't until perhaps when Vajpayee came with his bus sometime in the late 90s that the first time that any Indian Prime Minister was even willing to talk about the issue of Kashmir. Because for them it's just a non-issue. They're saying, you guys tried in 65, you didn't succeed. Why should we give you diplomatically? This is what they kept repeating in Tashkent, that why should we give you diplomatically something you tried to get militarily and failed?
And failed. It did close off a lot of diplomatic options, especially in terms of our foreign policy, where the position that we had with the US and the UN was to some extent compromised, and the US relationship got strained pretty severely because of 65 war. So,
I mean, I don't want to sound too negative all the time about the military or the diplomatic service, but one of the things, again, which came out during the 65 war was how badly planned, not just the military campaign was, but the diplomatic campaign. They always say that in any war, there are two clocks running. One is a military clock and one is a political clock. Because unless you're a superpower, the United Nations or other countries will start applying pressure very soon to end a war. Nobody wants to see major Asian countries fight each other. So as soon as the 65 war broke out, the very day it broke out, diplomatic efforts behind the scenes started in the United Nations, China, Russia, as a Soviet Union as it was then, America, Britain, France. Everybody's trying to end this war immediately. As soon as it starts, they just want to stop it. And again, there's a complete lack of diplomatic preparation. If you're going to go to war, you've made a decision that you want to go to war. You send your ambassadors, you send ministers out to friendly countries like China or America as it was then, and you warn them that, look, we may be starting a war, there may be a war, we don't want it, but it may happen. If it happens, what's your reaction? Will you help us? If you'll help us, how? Once the war broke out, only then was the former Air Chief Marshal, Askar Khan, sent on an emergency mission to China and said, can you help us? And the Chinese were totally stunned. They said, if you were going to start a war, which obviously you started, you could have discussed this with us 2 weeks ago, a month ago. Now that you've started a war, you now send somebody and ask us, in effect, to go to war with India without even asking our advice or permission or anything. So there was no diplomatic preparation whatsoever. So it wasn't just a military failing or military lack of preparation.
And of course, what about the United States? I mean, they were the principal suppliers to the Pakistan Army. And
well, there's a personal element to this.
Ji.
Professor Nauman read that bit about Comer and Johnson. President Johnson was a larger-than-life U.S. president at the time. He treated Ayub like a personal friend. He used to stay with him in his ranch in Texas. They were friends. When the war broke out, Lyndon Johnson was absolutely furious. He was a plain talking Texan, and his language was pretty unrepeatable most of the time. And apparently, when Ayub tried to call him a few times during the war, he wouldn't even take his phone calls.
right.
So when I was researching the book, I managed to get to the Johnson Library in Austin, Texas, and they actually had tape recordings of telephone calls. So there's a very dramatic telephone call. The minute that Ayub Khan has agreed to a ceasefire, Johnson finally agrees to speak to him on the phone. And being Pakistan, of course, the line was a bad one. So a couple of times the line actually was dropped. And again, the operator at the White House says the president of Pakistan's on the phone. So eventually Ayub calls him and says, I've decided that we're going to have a ceasefire. So Johnson says, good. And he says, I want to come and see you. And he says, okay, you can come and see me, but I'm not promising you any help. He's very blunt with him. He's very upset with him. You can tell on the phone call. If actually one of you ever goes there, you can listen to this call. It's available to anyone. And it's quite, shockingly blunt. He actually says to him that you decided to go to war and you're welcome to come to America. And when Ayub does eventually go to America, which he's compelled to do before Tashkent, he says to him, we're not going to help you. You guys did this by yourselves. The Russians have invited you to Tashkent. Good luck. Go there and try your luck with the Soviet Union because we wash our hands of this.
Yes, and that was, of course, one of the other assumptions that planners got wrong, that one was about Gibraltar that we've just discussed. One was this, that the US was a primary backer. I guess there was an assumption that there won't be a negative reaction or the arms embargo won't happen. The arms embargo must have come as a surprise to Ayub from the US.
Well, this is, again, absolutely amazing. I mean, why should it come as a surprise? It's absolutely clear from the American side. It couldn't have been clearer that all the weapons, all the aid they're giving to Pakistan is to help Pakistan join Western military pacts, the Baghdad Pact, CENTO, CETO, against the Soviet Union. Once these weapons are trained eastwards towards India, the Americans immediately cut off aid, and that shouldn't have been a surprise to anyone.
Brigadier, you were there at the... We have, 15 minutes? Yeah. Was that the arms embargo on Pakistan, was that something that was unforeseen? Was that something that was a calculated risk at the time? How did you, game that out?
Pakistan Army at that time was equipped with American arms, weapons, tanks and aircraft particularly, and heavy guns. But their logistics sustainability was about 15 to 17 days.
In an all-out conflict.
The Pakistan army was not equipped. Since it was not equipped, it was not capable of fighting a prolonged war. The Indians were much better. Logistically, they were much better. And they had ammunition and fuel and other things to last about 30 days, a little more than 30 days. So this embargo, it hurt us.
In addition to the embargo, we've just discussed, yes, there was a background of Kashmir. It was diplomatically we had come to accept that, the diplomatic resolution is not possible. So there was, I guess, some element of frustration in the leadership that, we have to do something. But having taken the decision to go for a military solution, even if some of the assumptions were faulty, they never thought of the US embargo and its effects. But was there, in the 65 war, was there any realistic chance that a positive outcome could have been achieved? Was there some mistakes made?
Yes. Mistakes? Blunder after blunder after blunder.
Gee.
Mistakes, you are paying them a compliment. You take Gibraltar. 14 or 15 days after they had infiltrated into Indian-occupied Kashmir, they had become the hunted. From hunters, they had become the hunted. Because the local population, the Muslim population, was not cooperating with them, with the infiltrators. And the worst thing was that they started collaborating with the Indian army against the infiltrators. So, 2 weeks after launch, that is night 4-5 August 1965, 2 weeks after launch, Gibraltar force limped across the ceasefire line, tired, hungry, and defeated. The Indian army in Kashmir went on the offensive. They captured Kargil in the north, Hajipir Pass, and Titwal. And they were threatening Muzaffarabad, the capital of Azad Kashmir. So Azad Kashmir was under tremendous pressure. To release that pressure, phase 2 of Ayub Khan's plan was activated in the form of Operation Grand Slam. So on 1st September, this was launched to release pressure on Azad Kashmir. On September 1, early in the morning, hundreds of artillery guns stunned the Indian soldiers. This was followed, this heavy artillery barrage was followed by an armored blitzkrieg thrust. Excuse me. And they went up to River Tavi. In fact, they went across Tavi also. And on 2nd September, the Operation Grand Slam was stopped. When Akhnur, which was their objective, was just a few kilometers away. When suddenly the operation, which was making rapid progress, the Indian army was on the run. When at this point the operation was stopped because it has been very clearly brought out in the book why the operation was stopped. The general commanding the Grand Slam forces, Major General Akhtar Hussain Malik, he was relieved of his command. And Yahya Khan took over. This change of command lasted 36 hours. There was no movement by the Grand Slam forces for 36 hours. 36 hours later, when they moved, they encountered well-sited defenses created by the reinforcements that the Indians were able to. The Western Command, Indian Western Command, Chief of Staff, Major General Joginder Singh, he said, he said, the enemy came to our rescue.
So that was
So-
basically the.
This, as soon as this thrust was resumed, it was stopped, but the Indians attacked Lahore on 6th of September to relieve pressure on, so pressure after pressure, releasing pressure, then pressure again, you know.
So after the Grand Slam was effectively aborted, so we basically lost the initiative, and so that was the end of the offensive war in Pakistan. It just became a defensive war after that.
Exactly.
So yeah, so we have some
We really need to
interesting
open it up to
panels.
the audience.
Thanks for your comments, and yeah, we would like to open up to the floor. Please.
Have you studied the genesis of the war and the role of Bhutto and Aziz Ahmed in convincing Ayub to start it?
Yeah. Yes, I have. I mean, every author is tempted to say, please read the book and you'll get the answer in there. But yes. But I always say, this is a very popular question when it comes to the origins of the 65 war. But I always say that ultimately the buck stops with the man in charge. The man in charge at the time was Ayub Khan. It was his decision. Yes, he was given conflicting advice. The Foreign Office gave one advice, other people gave other advice, but he decided to go with the advice. So I think the ultimate buck stops with Ayub Khan. I wouldn't blame Bhutto totally for that.
Who has the mic?
Can't hear. We
Sorry,
can't
I
hear you.
My feeling is that the war in 65 was begun by Ayub when he lost his moral authority. He lost the election to Fatima Jinnah, and he was hoping that through a victory in Kashmir, he would regain his moral authority.
No, I agree, actually. I think by and large, that's very true.
So there was a domestic political component too,
yeah, there
even
was.
though he won the election, but I think Fatima Jinnah's results were still stunningly
Well, it's very
impressive.
arguable as to who won the election, actually.
Yeah, well, that's the other angle.
अस्सलामुअलैकुम मैं स्टार्ट कर रहा आपने कहा ना 65 की वॉर से पहले गवर्नमेंट ने डिसाइड किया था कि मतलब
Sorry, आवाज़ नहीं आ रही.
आपकी बुक से हिसाब से 65 के वॉर से पहले गवर्नमेंट ने कहा कि भाई जम्मू कश्मीर का कोई हल नहीं, अब जंग करनी पड़ेगी, करेक्ट? और मैं फ़ख्र कर रहा हूँ हमारे आर्मी ने जिस तरह 10 गुना फौज को हराया, भी सलूट. मगर वो खुशी मिली, बहुत बहुत ज़्यादा खुशी मिली. 65 के बाद अभी 30-35 साल में जिस छोटे से मुल्क ने इतनी बड़ी आर्मी को, इतने बड़े मुल्क को शिकस्त दी है, 30 साल से ऐसे लग रहा है कि वो हमारे को ऊपर है, इकोनॉमिकली, कल्चर के हिसाब से, इवन स्पोर्ट्स में। मैं ये नहीं कह रहा हूँ, इंडिया बहुत बड़ा मुल्क है, इकोनॉमिक हमसे बड़ा होना चाहिए, स्पोर्ट में बड़ा होना चाहिए, सब चीज़ में बड़ा होना चाहिए, मगर हमारे ऊपर हावी वो, हमारे इकोनॉमी ख़त्म कर रहा वो, हमारे कल्चर ख़त्म कर रहा वो।
ठीक है, थैंक यू।
फिल्म ड्रामे वगैरह देख के हमारी मतलब हर चीज़ है। जस्ट मैं एक बात कहूँगा, हर चीज़ आप भूल जाए। मैं सिर्फ एक ही एडवाइस दूंगा। मैं बहुत जगह में यहाँ रहता भी नहीं, मतलब मैंने इंडियन के भी बहुत ज़रा मतलब जैसे देखे हैं। हम एक ही चीज़ भूल गए, हमारी ज़बान। हम लोग 100% उर्दू बोलते हैं, सही है, 10-15% इंग्लिश बोलते हैं।
ओके, थैंक यू जी।
प्रोग्राम में अगर और लोग आएंगे,
थैंक यू
तो
सर,
इंग्लिश समझेंगे
जी सर। ये क्वेश्चन है, प्लीज कमेंट्स के जरा ब्रीफ रखिए। फारूक भाई, वुड यू लाइक टू रिस्पॉन्ड टू दैट ब्रीफली?
There's not much to say.
A question from Mr. Farooq.
जी सर, ये क्वेश्चन है, प्लीज कमेंट्स के जरा ब्रीफ रखिए। फारूक भाई, वुड यू लाइक टू रिस्पॉन्ड टू दैट ब्रीफली?
There's not much to say.
A question from Mr. Farooq. Is your thrust of the book that if we had to go to war, we should have planned better? Or are you closer to what Professor Nauman said, that planning and no planning, this martial superiority complex is ingrained in us, and we will continue to commit, as Brigadier Saab said, such blunders, whether planned or ill-planned? So what's the thinking? Is the lack of planning or ingrained cultural martial superiority?
Interesting.
It's a difficult question. Personally, if you look back on it with hindsight, the best chance Pakistan had, if you want a military solution to Kashmir, was in 1962. At that stage, militarily, India was on the back foot. It had just been defeated by China. It was in a bit of a mess. Its military, Pakistan Army, was still had an advantage of sorts in Kashmir. But I do ask the wider question. Let's just suppose, if we just fantasize for a minute, let's suppose the Pakistani tanks had captured Akhnur or even got to Srinagar. Would we have been able to hold them? How long could you have held them for? Suppose the Indians had retaliated with their full force a year later, 2 years later. I'm not sure, if I'm totally honest, that there was ever a military solution to the Kashmir issue personally. But if there had to be one, the best chance is probably 3 years after we actually went to war.
Before.
Sorry,
A few
before.
years. Brigadier Javed, would you like to comment on that briefly?
Yeah, it's bad planning, lack of foresight, vision. You see, once they had decided to raise the stakes by sending in Gibraltar, by launching a Grand Slam, the High Command should have known that Gibraltar will evoke a strong response from the Indians. And Grand Slam, even a stronger one. Therefore, they should have planned to fight the war on their own terms, which they didn't. They were fighting the war half-heartedly. The planning was not there at all, because they were still thinking that Indians are not going to respond, and they will restrict the war to Kashmir.
My question is...
Can I also just say, in response to that, in terms of the racial thinking that we've inherited that I was talking about, it's part of it is thinking of people in blocks, yeah? So you think there's such a thing called the Muslims of the subcontinent or the Muslims of South Asia, yeah? And you assume that because they are Muslims, they're going to rise up, or they're sympathetic towards Pakistan, and they're going to, if we invade Kashmir, they're going to rise up, which was obviously a complete fantasy, a complete delusion and a complete fantasy, yes? But it came precisely from this block thinking, yeah? Your racial thinking. You think Muslims constitute some kind of a race, yeah, which you can immediately assume solidarity amongst. There is no such entity called the Muslims of India or the Muslims of whatever. Yeah, it's a delusional imperial fantasy. Yeah?
My question is directed towards Farooq Bajwa Saab. there was a common theory or phrase in the Ayub regime that the defense of the East lies in the West. So later on, when Bhutto resigned for his foreign ministry and blamed Ayub that East Pakistan was saved by the Chinese army. So could you highlight about that? Was it true?
I don't want to talk too much about that, except to say that I don't think in the 65 war that India genuinely had any plans to attack East Pakistan. I don't think that was a theatre of war. The theatre of war very much was the Punjab and Kashmir. So I think that was just a bit of a red herring, if I'm honest.
Yes, in our curriculum, we have always read that it was the Indian aggression that started the war. But some authors have written that they held Pakistan responsible because first Pakistan have sent 4,000 commandos on the Kashmir.
What, they were not commandos?
They
Infiltrators.
Infiltrators, whatever. So do you think, because Pakistan army thought that maybe it will be the regional war, but in response to that, India started the full-fledged war. So do you think Pakistan responsible for starting the war?
Yes.
Or India is responsible?
Absolutely.
That's what he's been saying.
Yes.
That's what the book is about.
65 war was started by Pakistan. The 71 war created conditions for a war against Pakistan on the Eastern Front.
One of the key decisions was clearly to change command.
Okay, last question, please. I think we are out of time.
One of the key decisions was clearly, military decisions anyway, was to decide to change command when Pakistan had the initiative. I wonder whether you could explain briefly the thinking behind that change of command, which led towards Pakistan ultimately losing the initiative and extending the war. Thank you.
Well, as Brigadier Saab just said, that was probably one of the turning points militarily. There's a complex set of reasons, but my own belief is that I don't honestly think that Pakistan wanted an all-out war with India. I think it wanted to put India on the back foot militarily, and it hoped that India would just want peace talks with some sort of binding arbitration. I don't think the goal was actually to defeat India militarily in an all-out war. So I think the change of command was meant to stop that provocation.
Just a word about this book.
Just, for wrapping up statements, can we have one from each before we wrap up, Brigadier Saab? We're closing down, so one more statement from each panelist before we wrap up.
This is the book, From Kutch to Tashkent, the Indo-Pakistan War of 1965. It's a brilliant book. Very, very deeply researched, thought-provoking, and very well written. And Mr. Farooq Bajwa has pulled no punches to name names and cite the serious failures of leadership on both sides. So what really matters is to win the war. Winning the war is more important than the careers of officers.
Thank you, Brigadier Saab.
I'd like
Nauman
to
Saab?
say, well, excellent book, and we need accounts of these major historical events, honest accounts like this one. I'd also like to say that we should really, really end 6th of September as a holiday. It is total propaganda, and it completely introduces ridiculous delusional ideas into the vast population, And we should also, the propaganda holidays, they've continued to increase them now. We have this another silly holiday coming next week. You know what I'm talking about. The most useless holiday in the world. So, again, related to the same question that we are dealing with here. Thank you, Bajwa Saab.
Well, thank you very much.
We like our holidays, Thank you, Farooq, for the lovely book. It's a great addition to our study of history. And thank you, Nauman Sahab. Thank you, Brigadier Javed Sahab, for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you, audience,
you.
for joining
Thank
us.
you.